Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, Kendra, thanks for shifting this to a online conference. I appreciate your work toward helping everybody stay safe. I am honored to be here today. I'm Gilson Capilouto, and I'm Professor Emerita in the College of Health Sciences, the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders here at UK. And I'm co-founder and chief clinical officer of Infant Labs. And Infant Labs is a digital health and medical device company based in Atlanta, Georgia. And our focus is on reducing the challenges of feeding by mouth for preterm and sick-term infants so they can go home to their families sooner. So my talk today is defining the unmet clinical need and the target market. So I have to start with my disclosures. I'm compensated for a post-retirement commitment to the University of Kentucky, and I also have a financial interest in Infant Labs, LLC. My objectives in this brief talk are to describe the steps for identifying a clinical unmet need, to summarize the considerations for understanding a potential market, and to hypothesize briefly about these principles and how they might apply to your own journey. So my journey, I'm going to start with my journey just to kind of give you a 30,000 foot view of how I identified a clinical unmet need and a market opportunity. And my journey started in 2010. So my status in 2010 was I was an associate professor in the College of Health Sciences. I was part of an interdisciplinary graduate clinic here on campus that was supported by state grant funding to follow babies who had been discharged from the neonatal intensive care unit here at UK, and to follow them until there were 3, because these babies that are in the NICU have a significantly higher risk of developmental issues in the early, which we want to identify as early as possible in those formative years. I was also PRN as a clinician, in addition to my faculty responsibilities in the neonatal intensive care unit to help neonates with feeding orally. So I would get a periodic request to see and serve patients and families in the NICU who were having difficulty with feeding. So the problem that we were addressing, or I was addressing clinically, is the fact that neonatal feeding is the most complex behavior of the newborn. And this is not widely known because many of these infants, or healthy term infants, make feeding look automatic. But these babies who have respiratory compromise and are born early and have multiple comorbidities or diseases associated with their preterm birth have significant issues feeding orally because it's a highly complex activity that requires integration of multiple body systems. And this difficulty can delay their discharge from as few as 2 days to as many as 45. And the incidence of, or prevalence of this problem, it varies with a low of 25 to 45% in the typical population, and then it rises significantly when we look at premature infants from a low of 40 to a high of 70. These babies often have respiratory disorders because our lungs aren't fully developed until we are 40 weeks gestational age, which contributes to their difficulty with oral feeding because, as you know, when we swallow, we stop breathing, and so it requires very specific coordination on the part of these fragile babies. And then we also know that over 500,000 babies are admitted to the NICU annually in the United States. So what's required for a baby to feed successfully? Well, they're required to maintain their attention during the duration of the feeding. They have to control and coordinate multiple systems, as I said, because the demands of feeding are physiologically difficult. And ultimately what you're wanting them to do is to protect their airway from compromise by fluid. And essentially what we're doing, all of you I'm sure have swallowed something the wrong way, and that's when fluid is going down into your lungs as opposed to going down the esophagus. So for these babies, we want them to protect their airway from compromise by fluid. So there are multiple reasons why these babies have difficulty with feeding, as I said. They could have neurological pathologies, respiratory issues, pathologies in their digestive tract because it's not fully developed. a lower tolerance to maintain their interaction because they're in an extrauterine environment when they should be in an intrauterine one. They have poor motor maturity due to the fact that they're born early, and they're not able to regulate their state or their awake sleep state because they are born too early. So the approach to the problem in 2010 has been essentially to stick one's finger in a baby's mouth and determine whether or not they were ready to feed. And so care was based on that. Of course, this test to see whether their sucking was sufficient for oral feeding was followed the physicians okay that they were medically stable and ready to begin oral feeding. So one of my first kind of notes for you all on the call or attending the conference is we need to be paying attention if we want to identify an unmet clinical need. So these ideas can come from anywhere. For me, what happened was I was in a conference focused on neonatal feeding, and the speaker talked about the fact that when adults are in the intensive care unit for more than 72 to 96 hours, their tongue muscle begins to atrophy and they can have difficulty with feeding and swallowing. I'm sure everybody on the call is familiar with the term atrophy, but this is what happens when you work out regularly and then all of a sudden you stop exercising your muscles, they get flabby and they don't work as well. And so that's what the speaker was talking about there, was the fact that tongue muscle begins to atrophy. And so what happens is we become at greater risk for compromising our swallowing and for items going into the lungs as opposed to the stomach. And she went on further to state that we did not know what was happening with preterm babies and sick-term babies who were in the neonatal intensive care unit and might not get to feed orally for extended periods of time. So if you think about it, for example, today, earliest life viability for a baby is at 23 weeks gestation. That means a baby could be born at 23 weeks gestational age. And the average age of beginning to take oral feeding is somewhere between 32 and 34 weeks gestational age. So they could go for extended periods of time without using their tongue muscle for actual nutritive intake. So that led me to a question that I scribbled down as I was sitting in that conference. Could alterations in tongue muscle function for preterm babies result in what we refer to as disuse atrophy and contribute to neonatal difficulty with oral feeding? So I was particularly interested in the tongue muscle because you can see from the sequence of slides that the tongue muscle plays a very vital role in successful infant feeding. So for example, if we look at this first portion of the swallow, we can see that the nipple, and this is breast or bottle, is held by the anterior portion of the tongue, and it sits all the way to the mid portion of the tongue, and it's also stabilized by the jaw. The first thing the baby does is he compresses the bottle nipple, and then what happens next is there's a simultaneous dropping down of the jaw while we maintain our latch on the nipple. And as we press against the nipple and build that intraoral pressure, fluid is expressed from the nipple. That fluid is then propelled to the back of the throat or the posterior pharyngeal wall to initiate the swallow, and then the process begins all over again. And this is just a picture showing how that is the same process that happens when we breastfeed. So you can see from this series of pictures that the tongue plays a very vital role, and if the tongue is weak and not doing its job, then there's going to be a higher risk of compromise of fluid into the lungs because the baby will not have the strength in order to do that simultaneous muscle work. So clinical questions like these lead to ideas. So my idea was, okay, could this be an issue? And then the next logical question is, how might we test that clinical question to determine whether or not this is indeed a problem? So essentially, the other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that anytime you're looking at a question like this, you want to be considering it in the context of the fact that entrepreneurship is a team sport, as are clinical research questions. So today, it's very rare that you can answer a question based on solely on your own expertise, but need to reach out to others who might have expertise that would help to answer this question or be important to consider in the answering of a question. So for me, that meant going to muscle biologists, muscle biomechanists, muscle physiologists, and biomedical researchers, biomedical engineers, to determine whether or not we could identify a way to actually test this idea that would be safe for babies in the neonatal intensive care unit. Simultaneously with that, I was doing a literature search, and of course in the entrepreneurial world, we refer to that as due diligence, to determine what do we know about this idea, and is there anything out there that's actually measuring it. And I only came across in 2010 two potential systems, neither of which were going to answer the question that I was interested in. At that time, there was the Crohn's sucking apparatus that only measured interoral pressure during pacifier sucking, which wasn't of interest to me. And then we had the N-trainer that was actually delivering impulses to the muscles around the mouth in order to train pacifier sucking. And this was not of interest to me. What was of interest to me was actually testing this hypothesis in a situation where a baby was actually taking liquid by mouth. So then I continued my literature search to see what we might know about it. And of course, there was no research looking at babies per se, but there were some research studies looking at animals. And this, of course, was also part of my due diligence. And I found a series of studies that were actually testing this hypothesis in rats. And so they were taking rat pups and they were dividing these rat litters into those who would be dame reared or breastfeed from their mother rats, and then those who would be fed intravenously. And essentially what they did after a certain period of time was they sacrificed the rats, and then they studied their tongue muscle, and they found indeed significant differences between these two groups, with the intravenously fed rat pups having fewer muscle fibers, smaller muscle fibers in the tongue, and actually fewer signals from the central nervous system to drive the muscle. For any of you that work out or train, you know that one of the things that we do when we're training is we're creating larger muscles with larger muscle fibers in order to create greater power. And so basically these researchers were suggesting that this could be happening in preterm babies who are not fed for extended periods of time using the oral musculature. And so I knew I had a precedent for actually pursuing this line of research, but I needed to identify a way to do this in babies. So again, like I said, it's a team sport, and these were some of the people that I consulted. Well, we had to start by doing proof of concept work. Is there a difference? First of all, can we measure it? Can we measure it safely? And is there a difference? Because if there is no difference in human babies, then we don't need to pursue this line of research. And so based on the information and input from the team, we identified a way to measure actual sucking in a fluid system using sonomicrometry. And we set out to receive funding, and we were fortunate enough to get a grant from the Kentucky Science and Engineering Foundation to actually do this pilot work to determine whether or not we were onto a clinical, if we had identified a clinical unmet need. And here you can see us collecting data. This was data being collected on a full-term baby. And you can see that even though the nipples were wired using the sonomicrometry method, the baby was not experiencing anything that touched them or interfered with their natural experience of feeding. You can also see from the picture on the right that this required significant amount of equipment going to the neonatal intensive care unit, and it required about 4 people in order to collect data. Well, I'm happy to say that in 2014, that work was finished, and we actually did find significant differences between preterm and full-term babies, suggesting that preterm babies did have differences in their tongue musculature that could be contributing to their abilities, with difficulty with oral feeding. So we knew we were off to the races, that we wanted to continue this line of research, but we had some problems. One of the most significant problems was the fact that this tool required too much space in the NICU and too many people to collect data. So we knew we were going to have to develop an alternative system that would get us the same information, but have a smaller footprint in the NICU, be portable and wireless, not interfere with the other life-saving equipment in the neonatal intensive care unit, be safe, sterile, disposable, and easy to use, with some review capability and offline data analytics. And so this is what we came up with, infant feeding solution. And you can see here what we're using is a cantilever system to measure tongue movement on nipple. It transmits that information wirelessly to this sensor. The sensor then transmits this information wirelessly to a tablet, so we can see in real time exactly what's happening when a baby sucks. The system is designed so that it accepts any standard bottle nipple that can be bought commercially at any store or that is used in NICUs across the country, as well as a standard bottle. So this is just a video showing how this system works. So you can see as the baby sucks, we're going to see a simultaneous trace on the tablet that allows us to actually test different interventions to determine whether or not we can improve the safety and efficiency of a baby's suck. This particular baby is being seen post discharge from the NICU, and so is sucking very well, and we have no problems. But the system is actually designed to help at bedside to identify problems that we might be able to intervene, provide specific interventions for. So at this point in time, between 2014 and today, we've done ongoing research and development to expand our products, but also advance the abilities of our existing products so that we have data analytics and reporting. We have cloud analytics that churn these waveforms using automated algorithms, so we can push down very specific metrics around sucking performance to our clinical partners. And we received FDA clearance in 2015, and so our systems and our products are in neonatal intensive care units and other facilities around the country. So that was my approach to identifying a clinical unmet need. But before we got money, we were going to have to identify the clinical market. And so basically, we looked at who is it that we're attempting to address, and who are the patients and families that we're attempting to address with this solution to a clinical unmet need. And of course, the most obvious was the NICU. And so it was a matter then of doing a little bit of research. What's the United States market for neonatal intensive care units? When we price out our system and we look at the number of babies who might be in need of this system, what's that market look like? And then, of course, we expand to the EU and also the rest of the world so we can have a better view of what the potential market is in the neonatal intensive care unit. And of course, when we're doing our doing our IP, we're seeking patent protection, not only in the US, but in the EU, China, and India as well. And then we also, as we looked at what was happening with full-term babies, we realized we also had a market in the well baby nursery as we read the pleas for technological solutions for making sure that all babies were safe before they went home, safe in terms of feeding before they went home. That became an additional market. And then when we realized that we also had telehealth capability with the nature of our system, we identified an outpatient and consumer in-home market as well. And so it was basically looking at what we had and determining its broadest applicability that allowed us to zero in on what our potential market opportunity might be. So today we see a lot of research related to the unmet clinical need. And so, one of the things that we did, but we didn't do it within this structure, which is an excellent structure for those of you who might be early on in this process in terms of identifying that unmet clinical need. We did many of these things, but we didn't have this nice structure that was set forth by Freeman and colleagues in 2019 in terms of identifying that unmet need. So some of you might want to look at this if you're especially in the disease space and patient space to determine whether or not it would be helpful in helping you meet those needs. And also, if you're looking at societal unmet needs, it might also hold some value. It's also important while you're looking at this to determine who your stakeholders might be for this unmet clinical need. Are they health technology administration bodies, payers, regulators, patients, all of the above? So that's really important, and also identifying what your clinical unmet need, what your potential market might be, but also how you might structure getting a potential solution out there to the general public. So to summarize so that we can answer any questions, we have 25 works to date supporting the need and efficacy of infant feeding solution. We have a robust portfolio of patents, trademarks, and proprietary data sets. And we've received a number of awards related to our technology and are moving to advance our company to the next level. So with that, I'll take any questions, and I hope I successfully met the objectives that we had at the beginning of the talk.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Does anybody have any, would anybody feel comfortable sharing what they're looking at and how they've identified theirs, or want to discuss possible strategies for identifying a clinical unmet need?
Sure. I mean, I've got just a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
How long did your concept design or going through, initial drafts of the device that you were talking about, how long did that process take?
The initial proof of concept device took about 9 months to come up with, and then we submitted our grant based on that design. And of course, we had to go through a lot of steps because it was an IDE. Mm-hmm. And so we did that. We had to work through the IRB here at UK. Once we jumped through those hoops, we were able to pull the trigger on our grant from the Kentucky Science and Engineering Foundation. Because it was a pilot study, it was relatively small. We were able to complete that work around late 2011, 2012. We spent 2012 through 2014 doing our prototyping for what ultimately became our design freeze and our device as it looks now. We supported that work, the testing of our prototyping, via grants from CCTS at UK, as well as the College of Health Sciences Office of Research. So we were very, very fortunate in that regard. So it took about 2 years. Actual design freeze took about 11 months, actually. We worked pretty fast. And so we were fortunate in that regard. We spent the ensuing years getting FDA clearance and actually getting grants to test that new design.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Capilouto, for your presentation. You did excellent, and you provided a lot of really good information for us today.